When I was in school, maybe around third grade, I remember that we had to draw a self-portrait, and at the bottom we had to write our name and what we wanted to be when we grew up. And that self-portrait hung in our kitchen where I grew up for years. I think at least until I was in college. I don't know who took that down and how dare they take it down now that I think of it, because it was a gorgeous self-portrait. But it said Kevin Kumashiro, teacher. So from my earliest memory, I can remember wanting to go into education. And I think that was inspired in large part by my parents.
Welcome to EdUp Accelerated Excellence, a podcast for the advancement of educational effectiveness and equity. I am your host, Jacob Easy II, PhD, PMP. In this episode, we sit down with and learn from Dr. Kevin Kumashiro on his perspectives regarding the non-neutral role of schools in social equity and the power of social movements. Let's get into it. This episode of EdUp Accelerated Excellence is supported in part by Elation Communications. Elation Communications is dedicated to amplifying diverse voices and driving meaningful change. At Elation Communications, we specialize in crafting authentic and inclusive communication strategies that resonate with diverse audiences. Are you a small business, nonprofit, disability, or education organization that values diversity, creativity, and excellence in communication? Then let Elation Communications help elevate your brand and amplify your voice. To learn more, contact us at elationcommunications.com. That's elationcommunications.com. So welcome, EdUp Accelerated Excellence community. We have another esteemed guest. He is internationally recognized as a scholar, an education advocate, a facilitator of change. He is an educational leader and the author of several books, the latest of which is Surrendered: Why Progressives Are Losing the Biggest Battles in Education, published by Teacher College Press. So welcome, Kevin Kumashiro. Kevin, welcome.
Jacob, what a treat to be here. Thanks so much for having me, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Excellent. So we're going to jump right into it, okay?
Sounds good.
So can you tell us, when did your passion for education begin and how was it nurtured?
Oh, well, thanks for the trip down memory lane.
Absolutely.
You know, my mother, her first career was a teacher.
Mhm.
Um, my father was the one who taught me to play baseball and to drive a car. And so I think I always had, and interestingly, I mean, most of my family went into either working with young people um, or becoming a teacher. Like my
Mhm.
sister is a professor, my younger brother is a school teacher, and my older brother is a pediatrician. And so I think, you know, working with young people, but particularly working as a teacher was something I think was always my aspiration. Even when I was really small, I used to take my stuffed animals and make them into my classroom and pretend I was a teacher. Um, and yeah, I would like try to do tutoring when I was a K-12 student. And I think from the very first part-time jobs I had in college, it was all getting me ready to be in education. And it's interesting because I think my journey has been one that allowed me to taste
Mhm.
um, the role of educator from really various like standpoints. So, you know, some of my earliest jobs was as a teacher, both in the US and abroad.
Mhm.
But I've also worked as a teacher educator, I've worked as an education scholar, I've worked as an advocate, as an organizer, and then now as an administrator in higher education that particularly is around, you know, schools of education, or as a consultant for schools of education. So yeah, my passion has been from the earliest memories. In fact, I'll say one final thing, like when I was in school, maybe around third grade. I remember that we had to draw a self-portrait, and at the bottom we had to write our name and what we wanted to be when we grew up. And that self-portrait hung in our kitchen where I grew up for years. I think at least until I was in college. I don't know who took that down and how dare they take it down now that I think of it, because it was a gorgeous self-portrait. But it said Kevin Kumashiro, teacher. So from my earliest memory, I can remember wanting to go into education. And I think that was inspired in large part by my parents.
It's probably one of your siblings who took it down. Um, but I grew up in Alabama, and as a young kid, I remember similar to what you just it brought back these memories to me as you were talking. I remember playing school and church outside with other kids in the neighborhood. So different people would take the role of, the pastor, and we would be some folks were in the choir and some folks were in the congregation, and then the other time it was, playing the role of a teacher. So or being and not necessarily that I was a teacher, but someone would be the teacher, and we would act out students. And it's interesting because this is the one profession where when we think about a calling of a new generation, students have been exposed to teaching, formal and informally, their whole lives until, through adulthood, and you say, now come be a teacher. And we'll get into that a bit more in this episode. So you are currently the interim dean for the School of Education at Hofstra University. Can you share with the EdUp Accelerated Excellence community what makes Hofstra and your education preparation program, or EPP, unique within the marketplace?
Well, thanks for asking about that. I think Hofstra, maybe its biggest impact is that it has prepared just a very, very large number of the teachers and principals and superintendents throughout Long Island,
Mm-hmm.
New York. And I think that's something that I've heard since I was since I was in conversations about coming here, is that people held that up as one of their points of pride. Um, and I think, there's always room for improvement, but I feel like that is a wonderful legacy to begin with. Like you want to have connections to the places that you're in, and you want people to feel like you're a go-to place for future educators. Um, I think that when I think about what I want to accomplish as a leader, I do think that connections with the local communities and districts is important. I also think, and this is hopefully something I'm bringing to this institution as well as to the previous place where I was a dean, which is University of San Francisco, as well as I guess any place that I'm working, is, you know, is to get us to think about what's the framework or the models that we're drawing on that help us think about the kind of impact we want to have in the world. And right now in higher education, a lot of our ways of thinking about how an institution is supposed to run and how we're supposed to assess our impact draws on the corporate world.
Mm-hmm.
And, there's a lot to learn from the corporate world. But I also feel like there are other places that we can look. And one of the places I look is social movements. Because I think what changes societies aren't simply our ability to change laws and elected leaders, but our ability to come together as groups of people to tell a different story, to reframe the debate, to sort of flip the narrative about who we are and what's possible in the world. And so I look to social movements to try to inform how I think about how an institution should conceptualize change and
Mm-hmm.
how we should try to bring about those changes in the different spaces we have the ability to have impact. So that's sort of some of how I think Hofstra has established itself.
Mm-hmm.
And then that's also where I think I hope to push any institution that I work with, whether it's Hofstra or elsewhere, as we think about the kind of impact that we want in the world that really is about advancing democracy and justice for everyone.
And you recently joined Hofstra, correct?
I did. I've been here since December and it's now April. Yeah.
Okay, so a few months, not yes, but we wish you all the best in this new role for sure. So I want to talk a bit about issues of equity. So you're known for your work as an anti-oppressive, their work in anti-oppressive education. Given the recent Supreme Court ruling against race-based admissions and many individuals and organizations currently campaigning for a new meaning of DEI or diversity, equity, and inclusion as did not earn it. So I don't want to give too much airtime to that, but um, because I have my own issues around this idea because I believe DEI in its intent is to be a positive. You have proposed using frames, as you just mentioned earlier, for analyzing issues, particularly for the exploration of contradictions. Can you recap for those who may not be aware of what anti-oppressive education is? And then, in your opinion, what lies behind this new idea of anti-DEI, particularly in this country that is pluralistic and espouses democracy? So, anti-oppressive education, and then what lies behind this anti-DEI issue in this country?
Well, I'm so appreciating, Jacob, your framing of the question. And thanks also for asking, because this is also your area of expertise. I know how we advance diversity and equity in education. Yeah, so some of the ways I think about the notion of anti-oppressive education is I like to kind of begin by naming the moment or
Mm-hmm.
naming the context that we find ourselves in. And sometimes it's helpful to make certain that how we name the problem or the context really surfaces the complexities and contradictions within. And so one way that I think about education is to say education was never neutral.
Mm,
Education was even never about leveling the playing field and preparing everyone to succeed.
mm,
We say today that one of the purposes of education is to provide equal educational opportunity. But in reality, that's not why we created the earliest public schools. It couldn't have been because we created the earliest public schools in this country to serve only a small group of people. You had to be white and male, and your family had to own property. And
mm-hmm,
as we were forced to include more and more students, we just came up with more and more ways to sort and differentiate them, such as through segregation or tracking or labeling or discipline. Today, we might say that the purpose is to provide equal educational opportunity. But in reality, the function of schools has historically been to sort. We've
mm,
just come up with different ways of doing that over time. Schools are not neutral when it comes to inequities, when it comes to racial disparities, when it comes to class barriers. No, actually, schools have historically served to solidify some of these inequities. And so when I think of the notion of anti-oppressive education, one of the things that I think is the starting premise is that schools are inequitable, that
mm,
different forms of injustice and oppression, like racism, like classism, like sexism, and so on, they're built in at the very foundations of schools. So schools, in other words, function in quite oppressive ways as the norm. That's
mm,
the starting place. And it's also why I think it's important to name these histories, why it's important to understand how schools at their very foundations are inequitable, is because it then helps us push back against people who say that things like DEI initiatives or affirmative action policies and practices, or multicultural inclusive curriculums, or student support services for those historically marginalized. Many
mm-hmm,
people say that these are extras. These are things that you didn't earn, that you get, but someone else. It's like the special treatment argument, right? A special advantage. And what I would say is those arguments make sense only so long as you think that the schools right now operate on a level playing field. But if we acknowledge that schools aren't on a level playing field, they never were, they're structurally built to be sort of inequitable,
mm-hmm,
then the policies like affirmative action, DEI, inclusive practices, support services for targeted populations, they're trying to level the playing field. They're not, in that sense, special advantages or special privileges. So anti-oppressive education is about grappling with how at our very roots, schools weren't designed to be equitable. They were designed for inequity. And additional types of initiatives. Under anti-oppressive education, I would put everything we're talking about: affirmative action policies, multicultural curriculum, DEI initiatives, and targeted support services, all school community partnerships. I mean, the list goes on and on. They're all about trying to get schools to be more inequitable than they are right now. One thing I'll say just as a closing comment on this is, we can ask ourselves, what do we think schools would look like if we were looking at a very totalitarian, kind of authoritarian, inequitable, even fascist nation state? And I would say, well, if we were in a very kind of repressive, oppressive society, what would we think schools would look like? Well, I would say it would look like the people at the very top get the very best schools. They're well-resourced. They're teaching you to think. They're teaching you to create. They're teaching you to lead. Well-resourced teachers, well-resourced classrooms and supplies. And what would the masses get? They would get something that's pretty watered down, that's impoverished, not well-paid teachers, out-of-date curriculum materials, buildings are falling apart, it's not well-funded, and so on and so forth, right? You're teaching not to think and lead, but to follow and obey. And if you step back, we'll realize, well, many scholars have argued that that's the school system we've created here in a supposed democracy. So it begs the question to me, well, then, what should schools look like if it's serving democracy? And I think that's really our challenge, is to say we've built a system that does not serve democracy. And our job is to actually not pretend that it's neutral, not pretend that it is, but to actually acknowledge that it is filled with all these contradictions. In fact, I'll say one more thing about contradiction. A school can be designed to maintain the status quo, and schools and universities around the world all fit this paradigm. But the reality is that schools and universities also always function in contradictory ways. You can be in a really repressive state where you're censored left and right, but schools are still planting seeds. It's why throughout the 20th century, some of the major social revolutions that happened around the world, where did they often take flight? It was at universities. And when repressive regimes go after the journalists and the artists and the scientists and the judges and the lawyers, they're also going after the teachers, because it's these groups, including schools and universities, whose role it is to get us to question the status quo. Schools are always filled with contradiction, and our job isn't to brush away and pretend those contradictions don't exist. Our job is to actually surface them and dive into them, because I believe that's how we best advance goals of equity and democracy.
Well, it's really interesting because I can see individuals who, when you make this, you describe this oppressive norm as baked into the sort of origin. I can see how some individuals will feel very uncomfortable with that, because we've bought into this idea that um, I mean, we know the US is a great sort of experiment in democracy, but everyone has equal opportunity, that we are all free and we are all individual agents, and it's really up to you to be able to make your way. So I can see how this notion of being oppressive as the norm baked in can ruffle feathers in some ways. And as you were talking about, and we can see how that aligned through that in terms of how a lot of the anti-DEI and censorship are in legislation in that regard are aimed specifically at spaces of education, whether it's P12, critical race theory in public schools. I would even say anti-drag in libraries, drag story time, but in also, these notions of anti-DEI in higher education. So, and one of our podcasts from our inspirational shorts, Rodney Towson says, if we want to be agents of change, we have to actually begin to engage. So we have to be in education or around education if we want to be agents of change. So thank you for that. So who can, um, I'm sorry, actually, how can educator preparation programs and institutions of higher education address in an effective way these issues that contribute to greater equity on campus through DEI, if they have the opportunity. And sometimes maybe in subversive ways, if we believe that diversity, and that's intellectual diversity, diversity of composition, equity, meaning that we all start at different places, as you mentioned earlier, and what our needs might be. And that we all, like you said, the community, involve the community. We are included, so we're not excluded from the educational enterprise. So how can institutions begin to think about effective ways of contributing to greater equity on campuses?
Well, I appreciate the question, and I also appreciate how I think the way you frame the question offers us a really helpful framework that we can take key concepts like community engagement or equity or, diversity, and we can find ways to operationalize each of these for our goals, for our strategic plans, for our missions, for our whatever, for our assessments. So that's, I think, one important thing is let's really try to dive deeply into operationalizing different concepts like justice, equity, inclusion, belonging, community, and so on. I think specific to how we might imagine preparing teachers, I'll tell a few quick stories. One is that I remember when it came to questions around how do we prepare teachers in a in a to teach in a space where there might be high stakes testing, scripted curriculums, all these rigid standards and all of that. And a lot of the folks that I was in conversations with were saying, well, we need to teach teachers how to protest and how to, push back, which of course I'm a big fan of protest and pushing back. I also feel like if that's all we do, we're doing a major disservice to the students in their classrooms who still have to take tests and there's still stakes attached to them. It also reminds me of, one time I was working, this is when I was supervising a student teacher, this is decades ago, and the student had a really hard time managing a classroom. And afterwards I was debriefing and I was like, there was just a lot of time in your classroom where a lot of students were off task. Like, how do you think about engaging your students to be more engaged with the material? And she said, well, you know, she wasn't really answering my question, but she was reflecting on how she can't wait, she said, till she's tenured or has job security in her teaching position so that she can just, go for the higher level classes, like the honors classes, the AP classes, because then she won't have the behavior problems and she can really teach. And I thought to myself, oh, we need to debrief that comment when we're in our seminar, because does really teaching happen only when students are all behaving the way you want them to behave? And then the final story I'll say before I try to answer your question is that this also makes me think of being at this panel discussion one time I was listening to, where it was about addressing, LGBTQ, lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer students and topics in schools. And there were a lot of mainly gay, lesbian identified teachers on this panel, teachers and administrators. And one after the next, they said, for them, the strategy is find a place where they can be fully out and find a place where they can be fully comfortable with who they are and talk about LGBTQ people and topics without fear of repercussion. And I thought that was in some ways very empowering for the people in the room to hear, but I raised my hand just to sort of say, I just want to offer a slightly different response, because I taught in a very conservative Catholic school once where, being out was just not possible. And would it have been great to be in a place where I was, everyone was accepted? I and everyone was accepted? I would say yes, but the reality is that that school needed people too. That school needed LGBTQ people and LGBTQ activists on LGBTQ issues who would advance for, equity and justice. And there's a role that people can play even in repressive contexts. So when I bring together these three stories, it makes me think of how the responsibility of teacher education is really to prepare teachers to teach towards justice in any context they find themselves in. And every context is going to be filled with the contradictions I was naming earlier. You don't have to be in a highly repressive state that is saying you cannot talk about anything. It's not only those spaces that teachers are going to be facing challenges. You can be in a super progressive community and still face challenges talking
Mm-hmm.
about, inclusive curriculum and so on. Our job isn't to say anti-oppressive education happens when you find that fully embracing space. Our job is to say every space is filled with contradiction. And your job is to figure out how to be subversive, how to appropriate that space in a way that advances the goals that you're trying to lay out for yourself. And I don't know that we do that enough in teacher preparation, but that to me should, particularly in this moment, should be elevated as one of our top priorities. How do you teach in spaces that are always going to be contradictory? How can we imagine our teaching as filled with contradiction as well?
Right. I think that's really important. You brought up yeah, I mean, my head now is full with ideas, so it's like fireworks. But you talked about curriculum, and I believe the new word that people like to use is managed curriculum as opposed to scripted. That's from my work in sort of school reform work, which even now that's a taboo word of reform.
Mm,
But one
mm.
thing I like to talk about with students, particularly when folks are thinking about how to make decisions for student learning in an environment of managed curricula, and that are highly that in these contexts in which their teaching is highly supervised, is to get really smart with data collection, data analysis, and data use. So if you're thinking about what is it you want students to learn, can you articulate and defend that students are learning, and justify your decisions with evidence? So that's sort of one way of thinking about how you can combat some of this notion of the rigidity around managed or scripted curricula. So let's talk about leadership a bit and educator preparation. So higher education leadership, similar to leadership in other industries, is thought to be mission driven, but yet it's daunting. So as you mentioned, these complexities and these contradictions, I don't believe there's any organization that is perfect. I think that there's always struggles within any organization. So for folks who are listening, if you're thinking about joining the workforce, no matter where you go, there will be issues. It's how you navigate those spaces in a productive way, not only for the organization, but also for your own well-being and your own professional growth. So daunting due to ever-changing demands on leaders, having to respond to enrollment demands. As you know, you're a dean, legislative and regulatory demands, you're familiar with those, political and cultural demands and changes, and the needs of individuals who work and study with them, meaning the leaders. So how might a leader navigate all of these ever-changing, this ever-changing climate for educational effectiveness? So not equity, but however you want to define effectiveness. When things continue to change, and sometimes the goalpost is the goalpost is moved on you after you've kicked the ball, to use a football analogy. But
Yes, yes. Your viewers cannot see, but I'm nodding vigorously as you're talking about the challenges that leaders face, constantly shifting demands and context and so on. As I'm thinking about the challenges that leaders face, I'm thinking about some narratives or rhetoric that we often hear in the leadership spaces around how we need to be and need to build our capacity to be, quote, transformative leaders.
mhm,
Um, and I always grapple, I always have mixed feelings about this term because I feel like, not that I don't think we should be transformative. Of course I do. I think that's our job, is not just to keep the ship sailing, but to constantly think about improvement and more,
mhm,
just impact in the world. But I also think that sometimes I hear people use that term as if they think it's the leader themselves who's going to come in and transform. And sometimes we search for the leader who's going to be able to lead us towards something better or lead the fight or whatever. Or sometimes we think of that as our own measure of success. And I guess what I would say is, I think that conversations about a transformative leader that rests on the ability of the leader, that individual to bring about change sets that leader up for failure. Because again, I think that, you know what, again, I go to social movements. What changes societies? Societies change not merely when we change the leader or the law. I think society changes when we begin to think and talk differently, when the paradigms have shifted, that's when societies begin to really change, right? I mean, there's a whole field of educational policy studies, and one of the major questions this entire field grapples with is how you can change a policy, but it doesn't actually change much. It doesn't change the institution very much. Why? Because everyone's thinking hasn't shifted to coincide with that policy change. So if we think about change as requiring paradigm shifts and cultural shifts, then we actually have to think about how what inaugurates those changes is a shift in the collective, not merely
Mhm.
who sits at the top. So all of this is to say that the way I think about and try to talk about leadership is that we need to build our capacity to lead collectively. We need to
Mhm.
build our capacity, the capacity of the institution, in other words, to bring a lot of people together to make decisions together or to
Mhm.
trust when others need to make decisions that maybe you don't have a role in making, that we as a collective are grappling with the larger philosophical kind of questions that we talked about earlier, like how education are systems. Education is a system that isn't necessarily built to democratize, but we hope it does anyway, and
Mhm.
sometimes it does, as a fluke sometimes. So how do we bring people together to push forward on the kinds of changes that are required for any institution to improve and to have a better impact in the world? I think those are some of the questions that I try to grapple with when I think about what it means for me to lead. Not simply how can I more effectively move on a particular policy change, but how do I build the capacity of this community or this institution to work collectively to a change or to engage collectively in leadership. And by the way, I would say the same thing about anything. If we want to think about improving teaching, like I think this is one of the major shortcomings of so many ways of thinking about teacher education reform
Mhm.
is we think about measuring individual output. We try to measure the ability of teachers to raise, say, test scores among their students. That's an individual output model for thinking about teacher effectiveness. But what if instead we said, our job, the whole point of value added modeling is to like get rid of all of the other factors and say, what's the value of that's added of having this teacher in the classroom or having this teacher prep program work with this teacher?
Mhm.
It's as if there's a singularity that we're trying to identify as the contributing factor. And what I would say is, no, we actually should go the opposite direction. That what teaches young people is it takes a village to raise a child, right? That saying is based on the idea that our job is to actually look at what's the role of the teacher in contributing to the larger village. That's what we
Mhm.
actually need to be assessing, not pretend there's no village and try to assess the impact of the teacher on the student, right? It's not looking at individual input, it's looking at system capacity building. And I would say the same thing with teacher prep. Our job isn't to say, let's remove everything else and try to figure out what's the impact of this program on this teacher's development. That's the opposite way to go. The
Mhm.
way we should be going is to say, to become a successful teacher, a whole system, a whole village needs to be in place. And my job is to figure out what's the contribution of this program in teacher prep program in that larger system or village. So whether we're talking about teaching, whether we're talking about teacher prep or teacher education, whether we're talking about leadership or whether we're talking about societal change,
Mhm.
all of these things, I think, rest to me on the notion that what brings about change and improvement is the collective, not the singularity of an individual.
I for the listeners, I'm smiling. As you said earlier, you were nodding vigorously. Um, I I really appreciate that because I was in conversations with another individual, and I heard this phrase, and you hear it regularly. Oh, if I could just reach one student, and I thought to myself, well, that's a poor goal because we have, if you go into a classroom, you often have, I mean, the smallest classes I've seen, I have seen some of 5 or 6 students, but mostly 15 is even small. You have 20 and sometimes up to close to 30 students. Even in a kindergarten classroom, I've seen those large classrooms. You're not afforded the opportunity to only reach one student. I mean, so think about the parents who sent their students, and you have to think to yourself, well, which student is going to be reached today? Is it my son or daughter? So I like this notion of a bit more systems and collective and communal perspective around effectiveness. So thank you for that. What would you say to any person who is thinking about going into education? Because right now we're both in New York, but there's a lot of conversation around the teacher shortage, and particularly and particularly there is a conversation around efforts to increase the number of male teachers of color. But what recommendations would you give to anyone thinking about coming into the teaching profession in general, and then also specifically for males of color?
Yeah. I mean, we so need to, as a society, embrace education as just a fundamental pillar of not just democracy, but just of like wellness and justice, right, for any society and for any individual. So I think part of our challenge is, um, how do we as a society reframe what it means to be a teacher? How do we get people to see that teaching is not just a noble profession, but it's a justice-oriented one? I'm
Mm-hmm.
reminded of working at several different institutions when I was starting out my career, where I would see so many young, especially students of color who were engaged in all sorts of um, justice activism, anti-racist causes and progressive causes. And a lot of them would say, yeah, they're interested in education, but they don't want to be a teacher, they want to be an activist, as if these are somehow separate. It's the same thing we hear with I don't want to be a leader. I want to be a change agent. And you're like, oh, so somehow a leader is like the bad, you've gone to the dark side, right? Instead of someone who can actually push for
Right.
justice change.
Right.
So I do think that reframing and getting us to think about the role of teacher as one that is about, say, racial justice and social justice and, anti-imperialism and climate justice. Like a teacher can be central to those and can be and should be seen as central to those efforts. Um, I think another thing I would say to folks is, again, it goes to reframing teaching. Like, I think if we conceptualize teaching as something that's a highly individualized act, it's not surprising that we all get burnt out doing that job.
Mm-hmm.
But if you can be part of a collective that approaches the job collectively, I think it'll allow you to imagine and embody this role very differently. You'll animate these roles very differently than what you see. And I think that's part of with both of the things I've said so far, we're
Mm-hmm.
sort of encouraging people to imagine the role of teaching very differently than it's been so far, right? And in
Mm-hmm.
fact, I was mentioning this at a talk I was giving recently where I was saying, even way back in the 90s, there was some wonderful research that was saying that one of the central, if not the central challenge that teacher education faces is not teaching people to teach. It's actually getting people to see that what you think good teaching is might not actually work for everyone else,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's not that people come into teacher prep programs and they don't think they know anything about teaching. The
Mm-hmm.
reality is that most people probably think they know exactly what good teaching is. It's what worked for them. And their goal is to try to do that
Right.
for everyone else. But the reality is that people who go into teaching are among the most successful people in education. You finished high school, you finished college, you're getting into a professional prep program. Like schooling actually worked for you. You're
Mm-hmm.
not part of the masses that schooling isn't working for. And therefore, you actually have to really think differently about what it means to teach. And so whether it's people who are choosing not to go into teaching or people who are choosing to go into teaching, we're all kind of stuck in very narrow ways of imagining what teaching can be. And so I think this is part of our job as a society, is to reframe, is to say, actually we can throw open the doors for what teaching can and should look like. One of the ways I think about that, for example, is I would say we often think that schooling is about preparing people to succeed in the world as it is.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say, I don't know if that's how I would define it, because I think that fits into what I said earlier, as schooling is about um, maintaining the status quo, right? Is it really then, if schooling was set up as a way to kind of help the elite succeed even more and keep the masses and sort of lower in the totem pole, then wouldn't that mean that success in school doesn't really reflect that you're smarter than anyone else? It doesn't
Mm,
actually mean you worked harder. Success in school, if we think about schools functioning to maintain the status quo, that means to me, success in school means simply that you've learned to play the game better than everyone else. It means that you've conformed better than everyone else, right? If schooling, in other words, has an assimilative function, then success in schools means you've assimilated better, right? It
mhm.
doesn't mean you're actually smarter or worked harder. So what I would say then is success isn't always what we should be aiming for. Our job isn't necessarily to prepare people to succeed in the system as it is. Our job is to prepare people or to build their capacity to imagine the system as it is not yet, to imagine the world as it could be, and then to build towards that world if we so choose. Like that's to me the liberatory, the democratizing, the anti-oppressive possibility of
Mm.
education. And I think if we can get people to see that that's the role that they can play, we might get a whole different group of people eager to becoming teachers.
I really like that. And, you talked about this notion of gaming the system. Um, it harkens back to your comment earlier about really teaching, which means students engage in teacher-pleasing behaviors.
Yes.
And then once you engage in teaching pleasing behaviors, of course, those are the students who receive more attention. Those are the students who often have higher grades or marks, as you would hear some people say. And so it's not that they have engaged in sort of liberatory or justice or deep learning. Well, that's not true because they've deep learned how to manage the system. So
Yeah.
and that sort of we talk about these different levels of curriculum, but that is a hidden curriculum that it's a political space that some individuals have learned, and most of I would say this to some extent, many of us who have excelled in education, we've learned those skills, and particularly those of us who come from cultures that are different from the traditional educational spaces in the curriculum that it espouses, that we've learned how to border cross, we've learned how to code switch. So we've learned how to do all the things that make us look really good in this space, and things that aren't offensive to those who are in charge of educating us. So
It's so
those are things that
true.
we do learn that are not part of that's the hidden curriculum, so to speak. So I don't I want to get into a few. I'm going to ask a counterpoint, really, actually, because my brain is moving in two directions right now. You really have me all of my neurons firing. But what has education or education preparation gotten right? And just make this a short response because I want to ask a few things about where you are right now in your career and where you're going. So what has education preparation gotten right?
Yeah. And I will keep this brief. I think that there's one thing that stands out to me. I think when education preparation is doing good work, is when they're teaching teachers that um, the work of teaching isn't simply about adding to what students already know.
Mm,
That the work of teaching to me is about getting students to question what they think they know.
hmm
That learning isn't just about adding more information. Learning involves unlearning. It involves being skeptical of what you thought.
hmm
And when we can conceptualize teaching in that way, I think we're more likely to grapple with the reality that when learning involves unlearning, it can make students uncomfortable. Right? Like there's all this controversy right now about, oh, let's not do things that make students uncomfortable. I would say learning happens only when students are confronted with discomforting questions, like maybe they didn't know already, maybe their assumptions are wrong. Learning often involves unlearning. Unlearning can make us uncomfortable,
mm,
and that discomfort can make us resist more information. So if you think your job is to simply give more information in a comfortable way, you might actually be setting yourself up for failure, because that means the more you try to give people more information, the more they might actually resist that information if it pushes up against their preconceived notions. But education can be far more effective if it recognizes that learning often involves unlearning, which
Mm-hmm.
can make us uncomfortable, which can make us resist. And therefore, learning needs to involve grappling with resistance, not assuming that students will be comfortable with everything that they're learning. And I think there's a lot of teacher education that is based on this idea that learning is a far more complicated and emotion-involved process,
Mm-hmm.
and that we will come up with ways of helping students work through that discomfort and resistance productively.
Well, my therapist would agree with you that the education can be uncomfortable. Learning can be uncomfortable. It's about unlearning to, and I don't want to say relearn, but for new, so this idea of expanding what one thought they knew. And I really like this concept of deep learning, which really is how we think about, we internalize, we won't forget it because it has some connection to lived experiences and purpose for the learner, him or herself. Um, Whether it's direct or, secondary or tertiary, one can connect to that idea of whatever we're learning. So I want to probe a bit more about you as Kevin Kumashiro. How do you handle work-life balance? We talked about the complexities of leadership, and all the ever change, the ever changing vicissitudes and so on and so forth. How do you manage this with work-life balance?
Well, I am so not a good model on finding that balance. I should take your workshop, Jacob, on how to better manage.
This is my learning, unlearning uncomfortableness. I've been told that I'm married to my work at times.
Yes, yes, we have similar messages from our friends and colleagues. Yeah, I think I need to be better. One of the ways though that one of the things I'm trying to prioritize in my life and in my daily schedule is the things that are about wellness for me.
Mm-hmm,
Like, we're so good at scheduling our tasks, and we're not
mm-hmm,
so good at scheduling wellness activities. And so literally putting on I actually put on my calendar things like my daily exercise routines, like when I have to reach out to friends to make plans for the weekend. Like, I literally put earlier in the week to reach out to people so that I have plans in the weekend. Have I had the minimum number of outings every week, like dinner outings and lunch outings? So like actually making good use of my online calendar so that I schedule in the wellness stuff, whether it's exercise or outings, social outings, making certain that I build in time. This will sound also really weird, but because I'm in an interim position and I'm not living at home, I actually have to remind myself to go out and get the healthy groceries at the grocery store.
Oh,
Otherwise,
wow.
I'm eating like really not so great food. And then the other, just in terms of routines, I mean, these are all about making more routinizing some of these things. So there's other things that I try to really build in every morning and every night. And those are also things I think of as wellness. And one of those is my kind of meditative and breathing exercises. And
Mm.
the other is my this is my joyful thing, although sometimes it's a little stressful, but I'm doing my morning and evening studying of Japanese language because I'm
Oh,
trying to
wow.
get better. So I'm using my online app, which I know you're not supposed to do right before you go to bed, but every morning and every night, this is another way I wind down. So it's something that brings joy into my life. So whether it's scheduling things on my calendar or routinizing things with a routine, those are some of my strategies. And it's all still a work in progress, but thank you for making me think through like what are some of the strategies for work-life balance. But that would be my encouragement to people. We are so good at scheduling our work.
Yeah,
Let's also schedule the things that we need to nourish our souls.
I receive it. Renee Middleton, who is she's emerita dean and professor at Ohio University. gave me that same counsel. What you just mentioned is about scheduling. She says, if you don't schedule it, chances are it won't happen. So you have to schedule a vacation or a break or downtime. But it sort of begs the question to me, oh, I probably need a personal assistant because, I think about how much time it takes to prioritize self and to
Mm.
put all that in your schedule, then I'm not doing work. So again, another contradiction. And to close out, for our EdUp Accelerated Excellence audience, what projects are you currently working on that we can expect soon?
Well, I am super appreciating the question. Thank you. Um, I would say three quick things come to mind. I'll be really quick. So one is I'm loving the appreciate the opportunity, by the way, to push my own work. So one is that my newest book comes out in June. Thank you very
Yes.
much. Yes, it's my fourth edition of Against Common Sense, which is my curriculum and teaching book. So I'm super excited about that. It's the 20th anniversary, actually, of that publication. So it's the
Mhm,
fourth edition and also the 20th anniversary. I think a second thing I would say is before I became interim dean, but also after I'm no longer interim dean, I like to plan convenings, whether it's
mhm,
leadership retreats or writing retreats or conferences or just bringing scholars together to work on projects over the long haul.
mhm,
So I'm looking forward to doing more of that kind of stuff. Like I think that's where I find the most rejuvenation is gathering with people who are trying to do justice work, and we're trying to figure out together how to do that. So the convenings I think are really important for me, and many of them are open to the public. And then I would say a third thing is, my next book, which I've been giving talks about recently, is not my typical education policy book or curriculum book. It's a weaving together of family history
mhm,
with political history and cultural history with education theory. And so this is a project that's really looking at what was happening in Hawaii in the late 1800s, early 1900s,
mhm,
how it was a site of contestation between the emerging empires of the US and Japan, both becoming powerhouses in the world as an empire. Um, and what was the unique place of Hawaii in all of this? And the reason I bring all of this up is because that's when my ancestors all immigrated from Japan to Hawaii.
mhm.
So it's been such a fun project to dive into this kind of intersection of all of that. And I don't know when that will ever be published, but that is one of those long-term personal loves that we all have that hopefully will materialize into a concrete project in the future. But yeah, be on the lookout. Hopefully in the next couple years, there's something about that comes out.
So most definitely. So we have a couple of projects to look forward to from you, and we're going to drop those in the we'll drop your books in the link for the podcast once we post it. But Kevin Kumashiro, I want to thank you for your time. Thank you for adding value to the work that we do here at EdUp Accelerated Excellence, advancing educational effectiveness and equity. So thank you.
You're doing such important work, Jacob, and what a treat to be part of your podcast. Thanks again.
All right, thank you. Thank you for engaging with the EdUp Accelerated Excellence community. You can find this episode and others on Spotify, iHeartRadio, and Apple Music. And if you like this episode, please don't forget to follow us and share within your network.